Infanteria, to je láska má. Infanteria.
Okay, well, it must be 2 o'clock in New York then, and 8 o'clock in Italy. Welcome everyone to ŠVEJKathon 2021. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of the Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek, with a continuous reading of the entire first part of the novel. I'm Chris Harwood. I'm the president of the New York chapter of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this program. I'm going to say some thank yous now, and I'll repeat them in about 9 hours when we're through. I would like to thank the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, which supports all of our programming, and the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which provided a grant to support especially our YouTube presence to get our programming, both live programming and online programming on YouTube. We'd like to thank all the individual donors who have supported us and made this and other programming possible, and the Czech Center, who's been our main media partner for this event. Also like to say special thank you to Kim, Halsey, and Bohemian for technical support. We're still relatively new with this webinar gig, and so 2 of them have been really helping us get ready for this and hopefully get through it. We would like to thank in advance all of the wonderful readers we're going to have. As you will see, these are people from all over the world and from different walks of life who are receiving no honoraria for their performances today and are doing it just out of their sheer enthusiasm. So we'd like to thank all of them. And we'd like to thank all the people who helped us find them. And that includes Miroslav Kondolina at the Czech Center, New York, Jackie de Villiers, Edward Einhorn, Vít Hořeš, Paul Wilson, and others. And so before we start the reading proper, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Václav Paris, who's an assistant professor of English and comparative literature at the City College of New York. And he is the author of the very recent publication, I believe out just last March with Oxford University Press, the book Evolutions of Modernist Epic, which deals with the effects of Darwinist theory on a number of major works of modernist literature. And chapter 3 of that book focuses on the Good Soldier Švejk. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You can see me, and I guess we've got Václav ready to go.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the ŠVEJKathon. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thank you for plugging my book, and thank you, Suzanna, for putting this event together, and thank you all for joining us. You can all hear me okay, right? Okay, so Jaroslav Hašek's The Good Soldier Švejk is a truly exceptional book. It's not the kind of book that appears every year. It's not the kind of book that appears every decade, and it's not even the kind of book that I think appears every century. Certainly no single work of Czech fiction that I know since the publication of the first part of this book almost exactly 100 years ago has had such a strong cultural influence. And in my mind, no single work of Czech fiction from the same period remains quite as relevant today. I am very excited to be celebrating Švejk's birthday with you, and I'm honored to be offering a few words of introduction. It's a real honor for me. I think it's a historical moment. Okay, so throughout the last 100 years, Švejk has been a kind of national epic in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, emerging very shortly after the declaration of independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The book was an immediate popular success in the 1920s. It's been popular for its entire career. In large part, of course, this is due to its tragicomic brilliance. Švejk is an extremely funny book, and it will, I hope, make you laugh out loud, even in this reading. It's important to realize in introducing it, though, that Švejk's prominence in Czech culture has not just been a result of the book's formal qualities and humor. It has also been due to its shifting political interpretations. In the first Czechoslovak Republic, so during the interwar period, it was possible to see Švejk as a kind of comic hero, a Czech everyman who not only survives the Great War with aplomb, but also helps the new nation emerge from under the yoke of empire. During the Second World War, equally, it was possible to see Švejk as a figure of the resistance, someone to turn to as a role model against Nazi oppression. This is, by the way, how Bertolt Brecht sees Švejk in his play, Švejk im Zweiten Weltkrieg, Švejk in the Second World War, as a kind of role model for the resistance. Later, of course, for communist ideologues in post-war Czechoslovakia, the Good Soldier Švejk figured or seemed to figure as a kind of socialist text, and its author Hašek was celebrated for his work in Siberia with the Red Army. And it's for this reason, among others, that it was never banned. In fact, many Czechs over the last 70 years were first exposed to the book in school as part of a national curriculum of sorts. So Švejk's a funny book. It's also a serious and very sad book in strange ways. And at various moments, it has been a politically very relevant book, which I think is ongoing. It's still true, right? I think many of us felt Švejk's relevance particularly strongly during the Trump era. At the same time, for many Czechs who often express a strong dislike of Švejk, Švejk has long been a kind of national embarrassment. The central conceit of the book is that Švejk survives and even thrives in the Great War thanks to his apparent imbecility. Every time the authorities try to pin the blame on him, to punish him, Švejk's naive smile, his goodwill, his enthusiastic incompetence end up turning the tables. For nationalist writers of the 1920s like Rudolf Medek or Karel Kosík, Švejk was consequently by no means a hero. He's a thief, he's a forger of dogs' pedigrees, he's a ready liar, and he has very few obviously praiseworthy characteristics. And so far from being a patriot, he, like Hašek, who was a turncoat, appears to be concerned only with saving his own skin. Far from a figure of resistance, he's equally a figure for passivity. And it's Švejk's lack of solid positioning, his lack of committed engagement, this reading suggests, that characterizes Czech cowardice and complicity, right, in the face of German fascism, then in the face of communism, and now perhaps in the face of neoliberal populism, or even Russian neo-imperialism. So despite its prominence, this is what I'm trying to say, the Good Soldier Švejk is still extremely difficult to place and still problematic. Is the book very simple or extremely complicated? Is it revolutionary or reactionary? Is it comic or is it tragic? Is Švejk an idiot genius or just an idiot? Is he a hero to be emulated or a defamation of all that is worth fighting for? And who exactly was Jaroslav Hašek, apart from being a bad Bohemian who died too young? In what context are we supposed to interpret it? Unlike other modernist authors, Hašek never cared much for the institutions of highbrow culture, including literature. He wrote mostly for money. He wasn't concerned with literary criticism or for making his place in the canon. His references tend to be very local, and his jokes tend to be very particular, to a particular space, that is, or place, which raises a question, is it even possible to translate Švejk? And I think all of these questions remain open to varying extents. I'm not going to offer any answers. I'm just going to put them out there to suggest some of the richness of the book. By the way, in terms of translation, we'll be reading Cecil Parrott's 1973 rendition. Parrott served as British ambassador in Prague during the 1960s. But apart from being a diplomat, he was also a great scholar and wrote a number of studies of Hašek's works. And actually, I think a really good biography of him called The Bad Bohemian. His studies are well researched, I recommend them. I like his translation. It has a charming period feel, setting Švejk into British World War I slang. I like his use of dated British English. Some people hate it. I think it's good at conveying a range of different class registers and class humor in the original text. And I think it's a good choice because it's the best English translation, or the best known English translation, I should say. And as such, it's become a kind of standard. Nevertheless, Parrott's translation is by no means perfect. His range of insults, for example, doesn't quite match Hašek's astonishing creativity in the field of coming up with insults. And certainly, undoubtedly, the book is not quite as funny in English as it is in Czech, nor is it quite as accessible, immediate, colloquial, or direct as it is in Czech, I think. There's a sort of barrier between English readers in this book. It's not part of the language in the same way. And in the United States, at least, where I've taught it to students a number of times, the Good Soldier Švejk clearly remains a kind of cult text. It's not something people have heard of. It's a little recherché, eccentric. It's something for specialists and lovers, not a ubiquitous classic of modern literature. So all of this raises another question, which is how can we begin at the dawn of the 2nd century with Švejk to come to terms with Hašek's book, to appreciate its lessons and to disseminate its message? And the answer, of course, is with a marathon reading. Offer 2 reasons why. Firstly, Švejk is an extremely oral text. As you'll see, when we start reading, it's full of dialogue and digressive stories. And while most of these stories are told by Švejk himself, the book includes also an astonishing range of different voices, registers, and languages. It is in many ways a social text, meant to happen out loud, meant to happen in a group as a communal event. Hašek did actually narrate part of it towards the end, rather than writing it down himself. So it's meant to happen out loud. I think he would have enjoyed a marathon reading, or have seen it as maybe more appropriate than private reading. And the second reason why a marathon reading is especially appropriate to this book is that it ranges very widely. You'll see that Švejk begins in Prague, but even here he's always on the move, passing from his home to the pub, to a jail cell, to the infirmary, to the asylum, to the army barracks. And then much of the second part of the book is taken up with Švejk's so-called anabasis, in which he wanders around southern Bohemia in a lackadaisical fashion. And the rest of the work almost all takes place on a train when they're inching forwards towards the Eastern Front. The book is a super marathon in itself, one that requires a certain kind of reading stamina. And more than stamina, it requires the qualities of endurance in a kind of fundamental sense. When you're running a marathon, I know this from personal experience, the only thing you should not do is stop. This quality of not being able to stop is key to Švejk in many ways. The critic Veronica Ambros long ago pointed out that there were relations between Hašek's book and the 1001 Stories of the Arabian Nights, in which Scheherazade must keep narrating, keep talking in order to avoid being violently executed. That is something of the position that Švejk is in, trying to avoid being punished by telling his absurd digressive stories, which slow down the progress towards the Eastern Front as well. And I think there's an analogy to be drawn between the position of the marathon reader, who is voicing Švejk's stories, and the position of the character. Keep calm, carry on. Keep calm and keep talking, keep calm and keep reading. As long as you do, the work and life will go on. And that, among other things, is what Švejk is all about. So I hope you enjoy the book as much as I always do. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think we're back to Chris now, right?
That's right. Thank you so much, Václav. This was everything I could have hoped for and more in an introduction. I think places the book exactly where our audience should have it to understand it, and gives a great justification for what we're doing today with this marathon reading. I guess before I start, or before I launch our first readers, I'm going to give just a brief disclaimer, because here we are in the 21st century. And there's going to be some things here that are a little objectionable. So I'm going to repeat the disclaimer that I issued to all of our volunteer readers. And this applies too for those of you at home. So as Václav mentioned, this novel was written 100 years ago. And I'll add that it was written by a man who made a hobby out of shocking and offending people. There's much in the language and situations depicted here that might be considered politically incorrect by today's standards. Hašek had a go at almost every aspect of his contemporary society but he was especially ruthless in his pillorying of organized religion and the Catholic Church in particular. So views expressed in the Good Soldier Švejk do not necessarily represent those of the New York chapter of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences. We have taken on this project with malice toward none, but with a willingness to laugh at almost everything that human beings do, and with the intention of celebrating in all its complexity what may be, as Václav well argued, the most influential Czech cultural text of all time. So I ask you to please join us in a similar spirit, or pardon us if you cannot. And so just before I turn the floor over to our first readers, I'm going to introduce in aggregate the first group of readers we'll have. And I'll show some titles so you can help identify them. And then we'll still just be passing the baton to one another as they go along until we get to our first break, at which point there will be a pause and I'll introduce the next cycle of readers. So our first readers, I'm going to take the liberty of reading the preface. It's just a single paragraph. And I am Chris Harwood, lecturer in Czech at Columbia University here in the city of New York. I will be followed by Gerald Turner, a translator in Prague, who will read the first part of chapter 1 at Švejk's apartment. Then when we go to the Chalice pub, we've got a team checking in from Istanbul. And that is Charles Sabatos, a professor of literature at the Yeditepe University. He's to be joined by two of his students, Ihsan Haloktalay and Ali Karakaya, who will enact the scene at the Chalice. Moving on to chapter 2, we will have Julie Hansen, my colleague, the Associate Professor of Slavic Languages at Uppsala University in Uppsala, Sweden. And she will be followed by David Manasian, a retired journalist in London. So, to begin, the preface. Great times call for great men. There are unknown heroes who are modest, with none of the historical glamour of a Napoleon. If you analyzed their character, you would find that it eclipsed even the glory of Alexander the Great. Today, you can meet in the streets of Prague a shabbily dressed man who is not even himself aware of his significance in the history of the great new era. He goes modestly on his way without bothering anyone, nor is he bothered by journalists asking for an interview. If you asked him his name, he would answer you simply and unassumingly, "I am Švejk." And this quiet, unassuming, shabbily dressed man is indeed that heroic and valiant good old soldier Švejk. In Austrian times, his name was once on the lips of all the citizens of the Kingdom of Bohemia, and in the Republic, his glory will not fade either. I am very fond of the good soldier Švejk, and in relating his adventures during the World War, I am convinced that this modest, anonymous hero will win the sympathy of all of you. Unlike that stupid fellow, Herostratus, he did not set fire to the temple of the goddess in Ephesus just to get himself into the newspapers and school books. And that is enough. And so with that, I would like to turn the spotlight to Gerald Turner, who will give us chapter 1, part 1.
Chapter 1. The good soldier Švejk intervenes in the Great War. "And so they've killed our Ferdinand," said the charwoman to Mr. Švejk, who had left military service years before after having been finally certified by an army medical board as an imbecile, and now lived by selling dogs, ugly mongrel monstrosities whose pedigrees he forged. Apart from this occupation, he suffered from rheumatism and was at this very moment rubbing his knees with Ellerman's embrocation. "Which Ferdinand, Mrs. Muller?" he asked, going on with the massaging. "I know 2 Ferdinands. One is a messenger at Prusha's, the chemist's, and once by mistake he drank a bottle of hair oil there. And the other is Ferdinand Kokoschka, who collects dog manure. Neither of them is any loss." "Oh no, sir, it's His Imperial Highness, the Archduke Ferdinand from Konopishcha, the fat churchy one." "Jesus Maria, exclaimed Švejk. What a grand job! And where did it happen to His Imperial Highness? They bumped him off at Sarajevo, sir, with a revolver, you know. He drove there in a car with his Archduchess. Well, there you have it, Mrs. Muller, in a car. Yes, of course, a gentleman like him can afford it, but he never imagines that a drive like that might finish up badly. And at Sarajevo into the bargain. That's in Bosnia, Mrs. Muller. Oh, I expect the Turks did it. You know, we never ought to have taken Bosnia and Herzegovina from them. And so you see, Mrs. Muller, His Imperial Highness now rests with the angels. Did he suffer long? His Imperial Highness was done for at once, sir. You know, a revolver isn't just a toy. Not long ago, there was a gentleman in Nusle, where I come from, who fooled about with a revolver too. And what happened? He shot his whole family and the porter too, who came up to see who was doing the shooting there on the 3rd floor. There are some revolvers, Mrs. Muller, that won't go off even if you bust yourself. There are lots of that type, but for His Imperial Highness, I'm sure they must have bought something better. And I wouldn't mind betting, Mrs. Muller, that the chap who did it put on smart togs for the occasion. Potting at an Imperial Highness is no easy job, you know. It's not like a poacher potting at a gamekeeper. The question is how you get at him. You can't come near a fine gentleman like that if you're dressed in rags. You've got to wear a topper so the cops don't nab you beforehand. They say there were a lot of them, sir. Well, of course, Mrs. Muller, said Švejk, finishing massaging his knees. If you wanted to kill His Imperial Highness, or for that matter, even His Imperial Majesty the Emperor, you'd certainly need advice. Several heads are wiser than one. One chap advises this, another that, and then the deed is crowned with success, as our national anthem says. The main thing is to watch out for the moment when a gentleman like that rides past, just like old Lucania, remember, who stabbed our late lamented Elizabeth with a file. He just went for a stroll with her. Who's going to trust anybody now? After that, there'll be no more strolls for empresses, and a lot of other persons will have it coming to them too, you know. You mark my words, Mrs. Muller, it'll be the turn of the Tsar and the Tsarina next, maybe, though God forbid, even of His Imperial Majesty the Emperor. Now, they started with his uncle. He's got lots of enemies, the old gentleman has, even more than Ferdinand. Not long ago, a gentleman was telling us in the pub that a time would come when all these emperors would get done in, one after the other, and all the king's horses and all the king's men wouldn't save them. After that, he hadn't any money to pay his bill. The landlord had to have him arrested. And he hit the landlord across the jaw once and the policeman twice. So after that, they took him away in a drunk's cart to sober him up again. Well, Mrs. Muller, what a world we live in, to be sure. What a loss for Austria again. When I was in the army, an infantryman once shot a captain. He loaded his rifle and went into his office. They told him he had no business there, but he went on insisting he must speak to the captain. The captain came out and at once gave him confined to barracks. But he took up his rifle and bang it went, plumb through the captain's heart. The bullet flew out of his back and damaged the office into the bargain. It smashed a bottle of ink, which messed up all the official documents. Oh, goodness! What happened to that soldier? Asked Mrs. Muller later while Švejk was dressing. He hanged himself on his braces, said Švejk, cleaning his bowler. And what's more, they weren't even his. He borrowed them from the warder on the excuse that his trousers were falling down. Do you think he should have waited until they shot him? You know, Mrs. Muller, in a situation like that, anyone would be in a flap. They reduced the warder to the ranks because of it and gave him 6 months. But he didn't sit them out. He ran away to Switzerland, and today he's a preacher of some church or other. Today there are very few honest people about, Mrs. Muller. I can imagine His Imperial Highness the Archduke Ferdinand made a mistake in Sarajevo about that chap who shot him. He saw a gentleman, thought, he must be a decent fellow who's giving me a cheer. And instead of that, he gave him bang, bang. Did he give him one bang or several, Mrs. Muller? The newspaper says, sir, that His Imperial Highness was riddled like a sieve. He emptied all his cartridges into him. Well, it goes jolly quickly, Mrs. Muller, terribly quickly. Now, I'll buy a Browning for a job like that. Looks like a toy, but in a couple of minutes you can shoot 20 archdukes with it, never mind whether they're thin or fat. Although between you and me, Mrs. Miller, a fat archduke's a better mark than a thin one. You may remember the time they shot that king of theirs in Portugal. He was a fat chap too. After all, you wouldn't expect a king to be thin, would you? Well, now I'm going to the pub, the Chalice, and if anyone comes here about that miniature pincher, which I took on an advance on, tell him I've got him in my kennels in the country, that I've only just cropped his ears, and he mustn't be moved until they heal up, otherwise they'll catch cold. Would you please give the key to the house porter? And I'm very pleased to pass the baton to Charles Sabatos in Istanbul.
And I'll be reading this section with my students, Haluk Talay and Ali Karakaya. There was only one guest sitting at the Chalice. It was the plainclothes police officer, Brettschneider, who worked for the state security. The landlord, Palivets, was washing up the glasses, and Brettschneider was vainly endeavoring to engage him in serious conversation.
Palivets was notorious for his foul mouth. Every second word of his was arse or shit. But at the same time, he was well read and told everyone to read what Victor Hugo wrote on this subject when he described the lance answer Napoleon's old guard gave to the British at the Battle of Waterloo.
Well, it's a glorious summer, said Brettschneider, embarking on a serious conversation.
Shit on everything, answered Palivets, putting the glasses away into a cupboard.
It's a fine thing they've done at Sarajevo, said Brettschneider with a faint hope.
With Sarajevo? Asked Palivets. Do you mean the wine cellar at Nuzla? They're always fighting there, you know. Of course, it's Nuzla.
At Sarajevo, in Bosnia, Mr. Palivets, they've just shot His Imperial Highness, the Archduke Ferdinand, there. What do you say to that?
I don't poke my nose into things like that. They can kiss my arse if I do. Palivets replied politely, lighting his pipe. Nowadays, if anyone got mixed up in a business like that, he'd risk breaking his neck. I'm a tradesman, and when anyone comes in here, orders a beer, I fill up his glass. But Sarajevo, politics, or the late lamented Archduke are nothing for people like us. They lead straight to Pancrats.
Brettschneider lapsed into silence and looked disappointedly round the empty pub. There used to be a picture of His Imperial Majesty hanging here once. He started up again after a while, just where the mirror hangs now.
Yes, you are right, Palivets replied. It did hang there, but the flies used to shit on it, so I put it away in the attic, you know. Somebody might be so free as to pass a remark about it, and then there could be unpleasantness. I don't want that, do I?
In Sarajevo, it must have been a pretty ugly business, Mr. Palivets.
This crafty, direct question evoked an extremely cautious answer from Palivets. At this time of the year, it's scorching hot in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When I served there, they had to put ice on our lieutenant's head.
Which regiment did you serve in, Mr. Palivets?
I can't possibly remember anything so unimportant. Bloody nonsense of that sort never interested me, and I've never bothered my head about it, answered Palivets. Curiosity killed a cat.
Brettschneider finally relapsed into silence. His gloomy face only lit up on the arrival of Švejk, who came into the pub, ordered a dark black beer, and remarked, "Today there'll be a morning in Vienna, too."
Brettschneider's eyes gleamed with hope. He said laconically, On Konopishche, there are 10 black flags.
"There should be 12, said Švejk after he had taken a swig.
What makes you think 12? Asked Brettschneider.
"To make it a round number. A dozen adds up better, and dozens always come cheaper," answered Švejk. There was a silence, which Švejk himself broke with a sigh. "And so he's already lying with God and the angels. Glory be, he didn't even live to be emperor. When I was serving in the army, a general once fell off his horse and killed himself without any fuss. They wanted to help him back onto his horse to lift him up, but to their surprise, he was completely dead, and he was going to be promoted field marshal. It happened at a review. These reviews never come to any good. In Sarajevo, there was a review too. I remember once at a parade like that, I had 20 buttons missing from my uniform, and they sent me into solitary confinement for a fortnight where I lay for 2 days trussed up like Lazarus. But in the army, you must have discipline. Otherwise, why would anyone bother at all? Our Lieutenant Makovets always used to say, there's got to be discipline, you bloody fools. Otherwise, you'd be climbing about on the trees like monkeys, but the army's going to make human beings of you, you godforsaken idiots. And isn't that true? Just imagine a park, let's say at Charles Square, and on every tree an undisciplined soldier. It's enough to give you a nightmare.
At Sarajevo, Brettschneider resumed, it was the Serbs who did it.
You're wrong there, replied Švejk. It was the Turks because of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Švejk expounded his views on Austrian foreign policy in the Balkans. In 1912, the Turks lost the war with Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. They had wanted Austria to help them, and when this didn't happen, they shot Ferdinand. Do you like the Turks? Said Švejk, turning to Palivets. Do you like those heathen dogs? You don't, do you?
One customer is as good as another, said Palivets. Never mind the Turk. For tradesmen like us, politics doesn't enter into it. Pay for your beer, sit down in my pub, and jabber what you like. That's my principle. It's all the same to me whether our Ferdinand was done in by a Serb or Turk, Catholic or Muslim, anarchist or young Czech.
All right now, Mr. Palivets, resumed Brettschneider, who was again beginning to despair of catching either of them out. But all the same, you'll admit that it's a great loss for Austria.
Švejk replied for the landlord, yes, it's a loss indeed. There's no denying it. A shocking loss. You can't replace Ferdinand by any two-penny, halfpenny idiot. Only he ought to have been still fatter.
What do you mean? Brettschneider livened up.
What do I mean? Švejk answered happily. Just this. If he'd been fatter, then of course he'd certainly have had a stroke long ago when he was chasing those old women at Konopiszce when they were collecting firewood and picking mushrooms on his estate, and he wouldn't have had to die such a shameful death. Just imagine, an uncle of His Imperial Majesty and shot? Why, it's a scandal. The newspapers are full of it. Years ago in Arbudjevice, a cattle dealer called Przecislav Ludwik was stabbed in the marketplace in a petty squabble. He had a son called Bohuslav, and whenever that lad came to sell his pigs, no one wanted to buy anything from him, and everyone said, that's the son of that chap who was stabbed. He's probably a first-class bastard too. There was nothing for him to do but to jump into the Vltava from that bridge at Krumlov, and they had to drag him, resurrect him, pump water out of him, and of course he had to die in the arms of the doctor just when he was giving him an injection.
You do make strange comparisons, I must say, said Brettschneider significantly. First, you talk about Ferdinand, and then about a cattle dealer.
Oh, no, I don't, Švejk defended himself. God forbid my wanting to compare anyone to anybody else. Mr. Palivets knows me very well. I've never compared anyone to anybody else, have I? But I wouldn't for the life of me want to be in the skin of that Archduke's widow. What's she going to do now? The children are orphans and the family estate at Konopiszce has no master. Marry a new Archduke? What would she get out of that? She'd only go with him to Sarajevo again and be widowed a second time. You know, years ago, there was a gamekeeper in Zliv near Hluboka. He had a very ugly name, Pinjor. Some poachers shot him and he left a widow and 2 little babes. Within a year, she married another gamekeeper, Pepik Shavlovitz from Midlovari, and they shot him too. And then she third time, again, a gamekeeper, and said, third time lucky, if it doesn't succeed this time, then I don't know what I shall do. Well, of course they shot him too, and with all these gamekeepers, she had 6 children altogether. She even went to the office of His Highness the Prince at Hluboka and complained that she'd had trouble with those gamekeepers. And so they recommended her a fellow called Jaresh, who was a water bailiff at the watchtower in Rajice. And can you imagine it? He was drowned when they were fishing the lake out, and she had 2 children by him. And then she took a pig gelder from Vodnyani, and one night he hit her over the head with his axe and gave himself up voluntarily. And when they hanged him afterward at the district court at Pisek, he bit the priest's nose and said he didn't regret anything. And he also said something extremely nasty about His Imperial Majesty.
And you don't happen to know what he said? Brettschneider asked hopefully.
I can't tell you because no one dared to repeat it, but I'm told that it was something so dreadful and horrible that one of the priests went mad, and they keep him to this day in solitary confinement so that it shan't get out. It wasn't the usual sort of insulting remark which people make about His Imperial Majesty, when they're tight.
And what sort of insulting remark do people make about His Imperial Majesty when they're tight? Asked Brettschneider.
Now come, gentlemen, please change the subject, said Palovets. You know I don't like it. Somebody might talk out of turn and we'd be sorry for it.
What sort of insulting remarks do people make about His Imperial Majesty when they're tight? Švejk repeated, all kinds. Get drunk, have the Austrian national anthem played, and you'll see what you start saying. You'll think up such a lot about His Imperial Majesty that if only half of it were true, it would be enough to disgrace him all his life. But the old gentleman really doesn't deserve it. Just think, his son Rudolf, lost in tender years, in full flower of his manhood. His wife Elizabeth, stabbed with a file. And then Jan Ort, also lost. His brother, the Emperor of Mexico, fenced a wall and shot in a fortress somewhere. And now again in his old age, they've shot his uncle. A chap needs iron nerves for that. And then some drunken bastard starts to swear at him. If the balloon went up today, I'd go as a volunteer and serve His Imperial Majesty to my last drop of blood. He took a deep draught of beer and continued. Do you really think His Imperial Majesty is going to put up with this sort of thing? If so, you don't know him at all. There'll have to be a war with the Turks. You killed my uncle, and so I'll bash your jaw. War is certain. Serbia and Russia will help us in it. There won't have to be a bloodbath.
Švejk looked beautiful in this prophetic moment. His simple face, smiling like a full moon, beamed with enthusiasm. Everything was so clear to him.
It may be, he said, continuing his account of Austria's future, that if we have war with the Turks, the Germans will attack us because the Germans and the stick together. You can't find bigger bastards anywhere. But we can ally ourselves with France, which has had a down on Germany since 1871. And then the balloon will go up. There'll be war. I won't say any more.
Brettschneider stood up and said solemnly, You don't need to. Just come along with me into the passage. I've got something to say to you there. Švejk followed the plainclothes police officer into the passage, where a little surprise awaited him. His drinking companion showed him his eaglet and announced that he was arresting him and would take him at once to police headquarters. Švejk tried to explain that the gentleman must be mistaken, that he was completely innocent and that he had not uttered a single word capable of offending anyone. However, Brettschneider told him that he had in fact committed several criminal offenses, including the crime of high treason.
Then they returned to the pub, and Švejk said to Palovets, I've had 5 beers, a couple of Frankfurters, and a roll. One more Slivovice and I must go because I'm under arrest.
Brettschneider showed Palovets his eaglet, stared at him for a moment, and then asked, Are you married?
I am.
And can Madame carry on the business for you during your absence?
She can.
Then it's all right, Mr. Palovets, said Brettschneider gaily. Call your wife here, give the business over to her, and in the evening we'll come for you.
Take it easy, Švejk consoled him. I'm only going there for high treason.
But what am I going for, moaned Palovets? After all, I've been so careful.
Brettschneider smiled and said triumphantly, Because you said the flies shitted on His Imperial Majesty. They'll certainly knock His Imperial Majesty out of your head there.
And so Švejk left the chalice under the escort of the plainclothes police officer. When they went out into the street, his face lit up with its good-natured smile, and he asked, Should I step down from the pavement?
What do you mean?
Under arrest, I have no right to walk on the pavement. When they passed through the door of police headquarters, Švejk said, Well, the time passed very pleasantly for us there. Do you often go to the chalice?
And while they were escorting Švejk to the reception office, Palovets at the chalice handed over the running of the pub to his weeping wife, consoling her in his own inimitable way. Don't cry, don't howl. What can they do to me because of some shit on a picture of His Imperial Majesty? And thus it was that the good soldier Švejk intervened in the Great War in his own sweet, charming way. It will interest historians that he saw far into the future. If the situation subsequently developed otherwise than he had expounded it at the chalice, we must bear in mind that he had never had any preparatory training in diplomacy. And that being said, I am now passing the mic to Julia Hansen in Uppsala, Sweden.
The Sarajevo assassination had filled police headquarters with numerous victims. They were brought in one after another, And the old inspector at the reception office said in his kindly tone, "That Ferdinand is going to cost you dear." When they had locked Švejk up in one of the numerous cells on that first floor, he found 6 persons already assembled there. 5 of them were sitting round the table, and in a corner, a middle-aged man was sitting on a bunk, as though trying to avoid the company of the others. Švejk started asking them in turn why they had been arrested. From the 5 sitting at the table, he received almost exactly the same answer. Because of Sarajevo, because of Ferdinand, because of the murder of His Imperial Highness. For Ferdinand, because they did away with His Imperial Highness at Sarajevo. The 6th, who was avoiding the company of the other 5, said he did not want to have anything to do with them in case any suspicion should fall on him. He was only detained here for attempted robbery with murder on a farmer Giles from Holice. Švejk sat down at the table with the conspirators, who were recounting for at least the 10th time how they had got there. All, except one, had been taken in a pub, a wine cellar, or a cafe. The exception was an unusually fat gentleman with glasses and tear-stained eyes, who had been arrested in his apartment because 2 days before the murder at Sarajevo, he had stood drinks for 2 Serbian students of engineering at the pub Ubreški, and had been seen by Detective Brixey drunk in their company in Montmartre, in Řetězová Street, where, as he had already confirmed by his signature on the police report, he had stood them drinks too. In reply to all questions during the preliminary investigation at police headquarters, he repeated the stereotyped moan, "I keep a stationer's shop," whereupon he received the equally stereotyped reply, "That's no excuse." The short gentleman, who had been taken in the wine cellar, was a professor of history and was expounding to the landlord the history of various assassinations. He was arrested at the very moment when he had completed a psychological analysis of every assassination and was saying, "The idea of an assassination is as simple as Columbus's egg." "Yes, just as simple as your for Pankratz," said the police inspector during the interrogation, capping his remark. The 3rd conspirator was the president of the charity organization Dobromil. On the day the assassination took place, Dobromil had organized a garden party with a concert. The sergeant of the gendarmerie came to ask the public to go home as Austria was in mourning, whereupon the president of Dobromil said good-naturedly, "Just wait a moment until we have finished playing our patriotic song, Hey Slovane." Now he was sitting there with bowed head and lamenting, "In August, we have new elections for the presidency. If I'm not home by then, I may not be elected. It's the 10th time I'm president. I'll never survive the shame." The late lamented Ferdinand played an odd trick on the 4th detainee, a man of sterling character and blameless reputation. For 2 whole days, he had avoided any talk about Ferdinand until in the evening at the cafe, while playing the card game Mariage, and trumping the king of spades with the 7 of clubs, he said, "7 pips, like at Sarajevo." The 5th man, who, as he said himself, was detained there because of that murder of His Imperial Highness at Sarajevo, was so scared that his hair and beard were still standing on end, and his head reminded one of a stable pincher. This man had not uttered a single word in the restaurant where he had been arrested. He had not even read the newspapers about the murder of Ferdinand and was sitting alone at the table when a gentleman came up to him, sat down opposite him, and said to him quickly, "Have you read it?" "No." "Do you know about it?" "No." "And do you know what it's about?" "No, I'm not interested." "But you ought to be interested." "I don't know what I ought to be interested in. I just smoke my cigar, drink my few glasses, have my supper, and don't read the newspapers. The newspapers tell lies. Why should I get excited?" And so you're not even interested in the murder at Sarajevo then? I'm not interested in any murder at all, whether it's at Prague, Vienna, Sarajevo, or London. For that, there are authorities, courts, and police. If at any time, anywhere, they kill anybody, it only serves him right. Why is he such a bloody, careless fool to get himself killed? Those were his last words in this conversation. From that moment on, he kept on repeating in intervals of 5 minutes, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent." He screamed out those words at the gate of police headquarters. He is going to repeat them when he is transferred to the criminal court at Prague. And with these words, he will enter his prison cell. When Švejk had heard all these dreadful conspiratorial tales, he thought it right to explain to the others the utter hopelessness of their position. "We're all of us in a nasty jam," he began his words of comfort. "You're not right when you say that nothing can happen to you or any of us. What have we got the police for except to punish us for talking out of turn? If the times are so dangerous that archdukes get shot, no one should be surprised if he's carried off to police headquarters. They're doing all this to make a splash so that Ferdinand can have some publicity before his funeral. The more of us there are here, the better it'll be for us, because it'll be all the jollier. When I was in the army, half a company of us were sometimes locked up together. And how many innocent people used to be condemned? And not only in the army, but in the civil courts too. I remember once a woman was sentenced for strangling her newly born twins, although she swore on oath that she couldn't have strangled twins when she'd given birth to only one little girl, which she had succeeded in strangling quite painlessly. She was sentenced for double murder all the same. Or that innocent gypsy who broke into a greengrocer's shop on Christmas Day in the night. He swore that he'd gone there to get warm, but it didn't help. Once it gets into the hands of the courts, it's bad. But that bad has to be. Perhaps all people aren't such scoundrels as you'd think them to be. But how can you tell the good chap from the rotter, especially nowadays at such a serious time as this, when they've bumped off Ferdinand? When I served in the army in Budějovice, the captain's dog got shot in a forest behind the parade ground. When he learned about it, he summoned us all, made us fall in, and ordered every 10th man to step forward. Of course, it goes without saying that I was one of the 10th men. And so we stood at attention without batting an eyelid. The captain went along our ranks and said, "You bastards, you swine, you brutes, you spotted hyenas, you, because of that dog, I'd like to send every bloody one of you into solitary confinement, make macaroni out of you, shoot you up, and make carp in blue sauce out of you. And to show you I'm not going to be soft with you, I'm giving you all 14 days confinement to barracks." And so there you are. Then it was all because of a mangy cur. And now it's all because of no less a person than His Imperial Highness. You have to have some horror to make the mourning worthwhile. I'm innocent, repeated the man with his hair on end. Jesus Christ was innocent too, said Švejk, and all the same they crucified him. No one anywhere has ever worried about a man being innocent. As they used to tell us in the army, keep your mouth shut and keep working. That's the best and finest thing of all. Švejk lay down on the bunk and fell asleep contentedly. And now I pass the mic to David Manation.
Meanwhile, they brought in 2 new detainees. One of them was a Bosnian. He walked up and down the cell, grinding his teeth, and every time he opened his mouth, said, "Jebem ti dušu." He was tortured by the thought that his peddler's basket would get lost at police headquarters. The other new guest was the landlord, Palovets. When he saw his friend Švejk, he woke him up and called out in the most tragic tones, "Now I'm here too." Švejk shook his hand cordially and said, "I'm glad about that. Really, I am. I knew that gentleman would keep his word when he said they'd come for you. Punctiliousness like that is a good thing." But Palovets remarked that punctiliousness of that sort was not worth a shit, and lowering his voice, asked Švejk whether the other gentlemen under arrest were thieves, because it might harm his business. Švejk explained to him that all of them belonged to the same party, arrested because of the Archduke, except the man who had been arrested for attempted robbery with murder on a farmer Giles from Police. Palovets took umbrage at this and said that he was not here for any pipsqueak of an Archduke, but because of His Imperial Majesty. And because the others began to show interest, he told them how his flies had defiled His Imperial Majesty. "They fouled him up for me, the vermin," he said, ending the description of his adventure. "And finally, they got me locked up. I'll never forgive those flies for that," he added menacingly. Švejk went back to bed, but he did not sleep long because they came to take him away for questioning. And so, mounting the staircase to the 3rd department for questioning, Švejk carried his cross up onto the hill of Golgotha, sublimely unconscious of his martyrdom. Observing the notice that spitting in the corridors was prohibited, he asked the policeman to allow him to spit in the spittoon, and beaming with his natural simplicity, said as he came into the office, "A very good evening to you all, gentlemen." Instead of a reply, someone pummeled him under the ribs and stood him in front of a table, behind which there sat a gentleman with a cold official face and features of such bestial cruelty that he might have just fallen out of Lombroso's book, Criminal Types. He gave Švejk a bloodthirsty look and said, "Take that idiotic expression off your face." "I can't help it," replied Švejk solemnly. "I was discharged from the army for idiocy and officially certified by a special commission as an idiot. I'm an official idiot." The gentleman of the criminal type ground his teeth. "What you're accused of and you've committed proves you've got all your wits about you." And now he proceeded to enumerate to Švejk a whole series of different crimes, beginning with high treason and ending with abuse of His Majesty and members of the imperial family. The central gem of this collection was Švejk's approval of the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, from which there branched out a string of fresh crimes, among which the shining light was the crime of incitement, as it had all happened in a public place. "What do you say to that?" the gentleman with features of bestial cruelty asked triumphantly. "Well, there's a lot of it," Švejk replied innocently. "You can have too much of a good thing. So there you are then. You admit it's true. I admit everything. You've got to be strict. Without strictness, no one would ever get anywhere. When I was in the army, shut your mug, shouted the police commissioner, and speak only when you're questioned. Do you understand? Of course I understand, said Švejk. Humbly report, I understand and am able to orient myself in everything you are pleased to say, sir. Whom are you in contact with? My charwoman, Your Honor. And you don't have any friends in political circles here? Yes, I do, Your Honor. I subscribe to the afternoon edition of Narodny Politika. The bitch. Get out, the gentleman with the bestial appearance roared at Švejk. As they were leading him out of the office, Švejk said, good night, Your Honor. Back in his cell, Švejk told all the detainees that this kind of interrogation was fun. They shout at you a bit and finally they kick you out. In the old days, continued Švejk, it used to be worse. I once read in a book how the accused had to walk on red hot iron and drink molten lead to prove whether they were innocent or not, or else they put their legs into Spanish boots or strung them up on the ladder if they couldn't confess, or they burnt their hips with a fireman's torch like they did to St. John of Nepomuc. They say that when they did it to him, he screamed like blue murder and didn't stop until they had thrown him from Elishka's bridge in a watertight sack. There were many cases like that. And even after that, they went and quartered the chap and stuck him on a stake somewhere near the museum. And if a chap like that was only thrown into a dungeon, he felt as if he were reborn. Nowadays, it's fun being locked up, Švejk continued with relish. There's no quartering, no Spanish boots. We've got bunks, a table, a bench. We're not all squashed together like sardines. We get soup, they give us bread and bring us a jug of water. We've got our latrines right under our snouts. You can see progress in everything. It's true that it's a bit far to the interrogation room. You've got to go along more than 3 corridors and up 1 staircase. But on the other hand, it's clean and lively in the corridors. They bring one person here, another there, young, old, female, male. You can be glad that at least you're not alone. Everyone goes his own sweet way, and no one need be afraid that in the office, they'll tell him, well, we've considered your case, and tomorrow you'll be quartered or burnt. The choice is up to you. That certainly wasn't an easy choice to make. And I think, gentlemen, that many of us at a time like that would be completely flummoxed by it. Yes, nowadays things have improved for our good. He had just finished his defense of the modern way of imprisoning citizens when a warder opened the door and shouted, Švejk, get dressed and come for interrogation. I shall indeed, answered Švejk. I've got no objection, but I'm afraid there may be some mistake here. I've already been thrown out from interrogation once. And I'm afraid that these other gentlemen who are here with me will be cross with me if I go twice for interrogation when they haven't been there even once the whole evening. They might be jealous of me. Get out and stop talking drivel, was the reply to Švejk's gentlemanly utterance. Švejk again found himself face to face with the gentleman of criminal type, who, without beating about the bush, asked him harshly and irrevocably, do you confess to everything? Švejk fixed his good blue eyes on the ruthless man and said softly, if you want me to confess, your worship, I shall. It can't do me any harm. But if you say, Švejk, don't confess to anything, I'll wriggle and wriggle out of it until there isn't a breath left in my body. The severe gentleman wrote something on the documents and, handing Švejk a pen, invited him to sign it. And Švejk signed Brettschneider's deposition with the following addition. All the above named accusations against me are founded on fact. Joseph Švejk. When he had signed, he turned to the severe gentleman. Have I got to sign anything else, or am I to come back in the morning? In the morning, you'll be taken off to the criminal court, was the answer. At what time, your worship? So that I don't oversleep, for Christ's sake. For the second time that day, there was a roar from the other side of the table, in front of which Švejk was standing. Get out! Returning to his new home behind bars, Švejk told the policeman who was escorting him, God, everything here goes like a house on fire. As soon as the door closed behind him, his fellow prisoners deluged him with questions of all kinds, to which he replied clearly, I've just admitted that I might have murdered the Archduke Ferdinand. 6 men crouched in horror under the lice-ridden blankets. Only the Bosnian said, Dobro došli. As he lay down on the bunk, Švejk said, it's stupid that we don't have an alarm clock here. But in the morning, he was woken up without an alarm clock. And at 6 o'clock sharp, he was carried away to the criminal court in the Green Antony. The early bird catches the worm, said Švejk to his fellow travelers when the Green Antony drove out of the gates of police headquarters.
Thank you, David. So we've come to the conclusion of this segment of our reading. We're going to take about a 5-minute pause, and we will resume after the pause with chapter 3. So this is a good time to get up, stretch your legs, use the facilities.
Za císaře pana a jeho rodinu. Za císaře pana a jeho rodinu. Museli jsme vybojovat Hercegovinu.